Welcome to Man in America. I'm your host, Seth Holhouse. So, as tensions escalate in Ukraine, Xi Jinping is showing strong support for Putin. Yet, just yesterday, George Soros harshly criticized Xi Jinping, actually comparing the upcoming Olympic Games to Nazi Germany. And Biden, well, he seems confused in the middle of all this. So, is there a bigger plan at play here, or are the elites scrambling for control as the COVID narrative collapses? We're going to dig into all this and more on today's show, where I'll be joined by Jeff Nyquist. Jeff has authored multiple books and is an expert on communism and geopolitics, two areas that are critical for us to understand right now. But before we get started, I have a few short messages for you. First off, if you want to follow me on social media, please head over to Telegram, type in Man in America. You're going to find me. Also, below in the description of the video, you can find the links to all of my social media links. You can also find my podcast. So every time I finish the show, immediately afterwards, I upload the show to my podcast channels so you can listen while driving or working, etc. So again, make sure you head over to Telegram, though. Find me at Man in America, because with all the big tech censorship, in case I get canceled, pulled off of YouTube, Facebook, you never know, you can still stay in touch with me. And finally, before we start, look, with inflation and a lot of instability in the markets, folks are looking for ways to protect their wealth. And I've always been one to recommend physical gold and silver. In the past year, a lot of you had asked me, said, Seth, do you have any recommendations as to where I can buy gold or silver? And to be honest, I was pretty hesitant to recommend anybody because unfortunately, there's a lot of shady dealers. I used to work in the industry, trust me. However, after doing a lot of research, I'm confident in recommending Noble Gold. I read through pages and pages of reviews, and look, I also called them as a customer to see how they'd handle the sale process and if they were using shady high pressure sales tactics, anything, and they didn't. They were actually quite fair with their pricing, and it was an overall good experience. And look, you're not going to get a good deal on gold. It's a commodity. If you get a really good deal, it's probably fake or maybe even stolen. What you want to look for is a fair transaction with someone you can trust. In addition, Noble Gold also specializes in IRA transfers, which allows you to transfer your IRA into physical gold and silver with zero taxes or penalties. If you want to learn more about this, open up a new tab right now and go to goldwithseth.com. Again, it's www.goldwithseth.com. And look, as I mentioned, I used to work in the precious metals industry. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to try to help out. I'm not a financial expert, but I've played that game before. So you can email me directly at gold@maninamerica.com. I'll personally respond. I'll give you my best advice. So, all right, on to today's show. Again, my guest, I'm so honored to have him on here, is Jeff Nyquist, who is the perfect person to talk to with everything happening around the world right now. So let's go ahead and welcome Jeff Nyquist.
Hi, Seth.
Hey, Jeff, welcome. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. The world's not, but I'm okay for now.
Yeah, I know you're up in Michigan. I'm in Ohio, and we're buried in about a foot of snow. So I can only imagine what life is like up there.
Colder, more snow.
Oh, good. So, Jeff, I've been trying to follow and understand what's happening, and that's not been easy. Can you just give us an overview of what are we seeing play out right now with Ukraine and Russia, and now Xi Jinping backing Putin and Biden and NATO? How can we make sense of what's happening over there?
Well, a brief synopsis. At the end of October, the U.S. government revealed, and I think it was the Washington Post that first covered it, that Russia was preparing for a major mobilization, and that this mobilization would very possibly lead to a war uh, in Ukraine, that there was some kind of plan to invade Ukraine, take some part of it, but it was a big mobilization. Um, this was picked up in Ukraine. Ukrainian press started discussing it in early November. You'll find Ukrainian articles. Sure enough, the mobilization started. The Russians started deploying forces. You see all these headlines, 100,000 troops put on the, of course, that's 100,000 troops is nothing. You can't invade Ukraine with 100,000. Ukrainian standing army is 165, and with their militia that they've mobilized, they got 250,000, maybe close to 300,000 now. But they haven't mobilized their 400,000 reservists. Um, but the Russian mobilization, which kind of started in November through December, now through January, now continuing in February. It isn't over yet. It just got word, what was it this morning, that new helicopter units, Soviet helicopter forces have been moved closer to the border, right? You've got, this morning, more trains, dozens of trains filled with military equipment and troops moving into Belarus, Russia, which is north of Ukraine. The deployment gets stronger and stronger. It is like U.S. intelligence said, they called it, it's true. This deployment is unlike anything we have seen before. And of course, NATO's nervous, the U.S. is nervous. The president of Ukraine, Zelensky, has told Biden to calm down. It's not a big deal. There's not going to be an invasion. And Ukraine, except for mobilizing these militias, which are not really serious formations in a war with Russian troops, Ukraine is not really mobilizing its reserves. Meanwhile, we're not talking about, it has been identified about 10 Russian armies assembling their forces. If 10 Russian armies are fully mobilized, an army is, Russian army is roughly 10 divisions, give or take. So a Russian division's over 10,000 at full mobilization.
So
Each
that's a
one of those
million
armies at full
troops.
mobilization is 100,000. That makes a million man mobilization. We're not talking about 100,000 mobilization here. We're talking about something much larger. And I think this morning you maybe saw the news items and the last couple of days where the Pentagon is saying the forces now on the border are sufficient to overwhelm the Ukrainian defenders, especially since Ukraine hasn't responded by mobilizing. This is the normal procedure, by the way, in countries in war, is that if your neighbor mobilizes, you have to, pretty much, if you want to be defended. And that's just accepted. In World War I, a Russian general very famously said mobilization is war. Because at the time, Serbia, remember the Archduke Francis Ferdinand got assassinated by the Black Hand. The Austrians started mobilizing, the Serbians mobilized, the Russians started to mobilize to defend the Serbians. The Kaiser wrote the Willie Nicky letter saying, don't mobilize because we'll have to mobilize, and then war will start. And the Russians mobilized anyway. The Tsar got talked out of it by his generals because his generals wanted the war because they thought they could win because they were allied with the French. The French wanted the war because they wanted Alsace and Lorraine back. So everybody ended up mobilizing and going to war because mobilization is war. And the thing is what's interesting about this is NATO, America, even Ukraine are looking at this mobilization and saying, oh no, there's no threat. He's not really going to do it. So I'm going to let the Russian military go to full mobilization, be completely capable not only of overrunning Ukraine, but when they get done with that, with the blitzkrieg in Ukraine, be in a position then to start dictating to NATO because they don't have to send those troops home. And NATO's not mobilizing. I mean,
Oh, wh-
Biden put 8,500 troops on emergency alert to send to Poland and Romania. And some people said, oh, he's going to send them to Ukraine. No, he's not. And if you look at a
why
military
does
map, yeah.
yeah, why does Russia Ukraine's obviously not a threat to them. So why is this just, kind of a step towards a, global hegemony, or why does Russia even want to overtake Ukraine?
Well, Putin, there's multiple levels to this. Putin has always said, and he said it for years now, that Ukraine is not a sovereign country. It's not a real country. Okay. And by the way, if we go back to the 1990s, I think it was General Grachev, the defense minister of the Russian Federation, went to Brussels in front of the NATO Council and basically said all the former Soviet republics that directly border on Russia are near abroad, and they don't have normal sovereignty. We have the right to send troops into those countries anytime we want. So that's just been the way it's been. And in 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine, annexed Crimea, started a civil war in eastern Ukraine, and in 2008 they invaded Georgia, and annexed parts of Georgia. You know, parts of what's Ingushetia, and then there's another enclave along the Black Sea coast. Basically, those enclaves open up the mountain passes so that Georgia is basically defenseless. If the Russians decide to go into Georgia, it's not defensible. The country can't be defended. And that was really the purpose of the 2008 incursion by the Russians, was to make sure that they had the position in the future that they could just go in there at any time and they couldn't be stopped. If you look at a map of Ukraine, by the way, have you seen any of the military maps of the deployments?
No, I haven't.
Um, well, let me describe it so you have a good idea. Ukraine is almost encircled by the Russian forces now. You know that Belarus is in military union with Russia. Its armed forces, which are supposedly engaged in military exercises, but they're not in the places they said they would be doing the exercises. Their military's getting ready. The Russians have moved tens of thousands of troops into Belarus. Railroad cars have been moving into there, laying supplies and the foundations for an offensive from that territory. Mostly mechanized infantry troops, although Russia's elite paratroop divisions are deployed almost close to the Polish border in deployment maps I've seen. So you have all the way in the north. And why paratroops over here? Because paratroops can rapidly be dropped behind Kiev and cut the country off from NATO, block the roads and railroads, stop supplies. And so there's the north. And then the east, you have the regular Russian deployments there in the east of Ukraine. And then a large deployment in Crimea, unbelievably large, with amphibious vessels brought in so that they could land on the east bank of the Dnieper River. They can land against Odessa. And then in Moldova, in the Moldovan, supposedly independent former Soviet Republic, there's an enclave where a Russian mechanized regiment's been deployed. And they could beef that up in the next couple of weeks, because Russia's going to take a couple more weeks of deploying, I believe, before they do anything. Because this is a serious big buildup. And they have, in previous buildups, they haven't moved fuel forward. They've been playing a shell game with their fuel. They have the report you maybe saw, they've made preparations, our intelligence has detected, to move blood for wounded soldiers forward. This is not
This is serious.
Yeah, it is serious. And yet the West, this is the attitude, except for the Pentagon, who they're the military experts, right? The president of Ukraine says, oh, nothing's going to happen, it's just an exercise. And the politicians in Europe have gotten to the point where they really don't want to say anything, because any country that says anything gets Russia says, you better shut up or we're going to do something to you, right? We won't say what we're going to do to you, but we're going to, when Sweden and Finland talked about joining NATO here, Russia threatened them. Unspecific threats, but they threatened them. And I think it was the Swedish defense minister said, excuse me, Sweden is a sovereign country. We can make alliance with whoever we want. And we know you're threatening us. Your drones have been flying over our nuclear power plant, right? So Sweden should be concerned. They are worried. They got rid of their military after the end of the Cold War, and with the 2014 invasion of Ukraine, they said, oh my gosh, the Russians could move on us and they could take us over in a fortnight. Or no, they could take us over in a few days. We have no defense. So they started rebuilding. Same thing with Finland. These countries started to realize, These countries, I mean, the Baltic states, the Russians make a big thing about the Baltic states join NATO and that threatens us. Do you know what the Baltic state militaries are like? They're like infantry brigades that have almost no combat potential in the modern context, right? The Russians have powerful artillery brigades made up of missile artillery that some of them have thermobaric bomb warheads that are the equivalent of a tactical nuclear weapon. These countries couldn't withstand Russia I mean, you would, I mean, the Baltic states would be overrun by Russia in a matter of a day or two. There would be no defense. Um, Poland, Poland's, what do they got? 15 brigades, maybe? They can't defend the Savaki Gap or Bialystok for more than a day or two. They did a war game in Poland here recently to see how they would do against a Russian invasion. And by the way, the Russian forces in Belarus, Russia, are even greater than that war game depicted what they would be, what they're going to be. I think, if I remember right, in 4 or 5 days, Warsaw fell, and Poland had to surrender. So the idea that NATO is a threat to we know. I mean, if you've read the press, the French military, which is the strongest army in NATO in Europe. I mean, the strongest army in NATO is the United States, but most of our forces are all over the world. And the next strongest is Turkey, but Turkey's not in Europe. Turkey's in, what we call Asia Minor. The French army is not ready for a peer-to-peer war. They won't be ready for 2, 3 more years. They've created initiatives to make their army ready, but they've let their army go. They don't have the conventional strength. Germany, the German army is a disgrace. It's much smaller than the French army, and their tank formations, they've even said we have to pull them out of the line. They're not, they would just be wiped out. They're not trained properly. They don't have the proper logistics. Their U-boats have been out of order for a couple of years. God knows if any of them can go to sea. Last time I saw a news item on them, and it was like they were in a hopeless condition. Italy and Spain, they have their rapid deployment forces. Those are pretty good troops, but those are light infantry troops, and there's not that many of them. What has NATO got? The Polish, the rapid deployment forces, the French, if they can get their act together, the Turks. Turks are going to be defending Turkey, not Europe. NATO is, and by the way, as the Russians promised to get rid of their tactical nuclear forces at the end of the Cold War, they put them in storage, and now they've brought them out again. They have
Yes.
20,000 tactical nuclear weapons.
So that
I
leads
mean,
me to
yeah.
my next question with this is that, so you and I have talked before, and you've said basically they feigned the fall of communism as a just to throw everybody off, but actually it was out of strength that they pretended to fall, and that the Russians and the Chinese have had a long time, pact and agreement to work together to eventually bring down the West. So do you think that that Ukraine is potentially a strategic place for the West, for the United States and NATO to place weapons, to aim them at Russia, and that is Russia potentially taking Ukraine and Putin being backed by Xi part of a bigger plan to engage the U.S. and start to advance on the overall, what I understand from you to be a bigger plan to bring down the West?
The main target of Russian and Chinese strategy is to destroy and defeat the United States. Because if the United States doesn't exist as a major power, all the other countries have to come to terms with Russia and China. That's just that's sort of an ABC simple way to look at it. And yeah, you've kind of outlined what I've been saying, which is incredible to most people, because most people haven't read the defector literature. They haven't looked at the strategic moves. And I'll try to make it simple. Russia's strategic orientation, that is what they want and what they've been acting to get over the last 30 years, has been misunderstood. And China's strategic orientation has been misunderstood. Right? China's our economic partner. They're our buddies. They're making 50% of our medicines. They're not building the world's largest navy anymore. No, oh, wait a minute. They are. They have more warships than we do. Russian and Chinese navies now are combined twice as big as ours. and they have hypersonic missiles, which basically make our aircraft carriers obsolete. That's not an accident. That's policy. That all happened intentionally while we were dealing with Afghanistan, where we lost, and Iraq, where we lost, because Iraq is going to become a subsidiary of Iran because they're all Shiite, right? We made democracy there, so the Shiites ended up, so they become part of Iran. And we paid all those trillions so that those countries could become part of the Eastern Bloc. That's what we really essentially did because we didn't know what we were doing strategically. So these two orientations of Russia and China have not been understood. Now, it's very important to mask your goals strategically because if the West understood that they were our enemy and they were been working against us the whole time while pretending to be our friend and pretending to be more democratic or reforming, we would have taken some more precautions, but we didn't because we didn't realize it. And the actual strategy that Russia and China are following was adopted in 1960 after intensive planning in the late 1950s under Khrushchev and with the agreement of Mao Zedong. A false split between Russia and China was agreed upon to bring the West in to build up China because Russia did not have the economic wherewithal to build up China. And it was an
And if China
opposite.
was tied to Russia,
It
the
was an
US would have never gone in there and built up a communist competitor.
right. I mean, in the 1950s, people called China Soviet China. In the 1960s, they called it Red China, right? And so uh, a false split, and then the other operation, long-term operation they went on was to convince the West that Russia was no longer run by communists and therefore posed no threat to the West. And the whole idea being that when the West went to sleep, they would build up in the next decades and overtake the West, and then present the West with the fait accompli of being so strong that the West has to basically give up or be crushed. And this outline of Russian-Chinese strategy was first presented publicly in 1984 in a book, a very controversial book by a Russian defector named Anatoly Golitsyn. The book was called New Lies for Old. It was published by Dodd and Mead. And in the book, there were 140 falsifiable predictions about what Russia and China would do in the future. And the predictions are still coming true because he said they would be aligned, that their dispute would be suddenly resolved and they would be allies and it would be one clenched fist, which we're seeing now. And if you were to read Golitsyn's book and then look at the documents, the evidence, the testimony, the other defectors since then, whatever errors Golitsyn made, and people will point out the errors and say he was wrong about everything. No, he was 94% right in 1994, and he's like 97% right now because the one clenched fist he predicted is now emerged. So his predictions are right. And if it sounds incredible that they could have done this deception, I challenge everybody, read Golitsyn's book, then read Karen DeWish's book, Putin's Kleptocracy. And keep in mind, DeWish says Russia was taken over by a mafia under Putin, the KGB guy. Well, I would submit in a country where criminals have no rights like they do in America, the KGB is the ultimate criminal organization, and they corralled all the other criminals. So the KGB didn't start working for the mafia. The mafia started working for the KGB and the communist structures that were hidden underneath. And I've heard a very smart Ukrainian I know said, we're not fighting the KGB, we're fighting the Communist Party, Soviet Union underground that still exists, still controls Ukraine, still controls Russia. And this is why Ukraine is not mobilizing, because it's essentially still Soviet, and they want it to be as bloodless as possible when they go in.
So do you
So
think
when
that's why
you
the president of Ukraine is just appearing to lie down?
Yes, absolutely. And he was elected basically with Russian money. Same thing with his predecessor, Poroshenko, who his chocolate shops in Moscow never closed. So um, what I would say, you read Golitsyn and then you read DeWish talks in detail about the changes in Russia. And if you look at those details after reading Golitsyn, how he said the changes would be false and would be controlled, all the evidence that DeWish presents, and it's massive, could be interpreted, could actually, it confirms Gallitzin. She's just come to the wrong conclusion about who's ultimately behind it. And so that's my overarching analysis. That's why this is, to me, this is much more dangerous, what's going on now, than even what the Pentagon is. Pentagon's very panicked because military experts, when some of the maps you see about the deployment shows is done in battalion tactical groups, but actually Russia's reaffirmed the division system. So when you see the names, when they've identified the names of armies, corps, and divisions, and brigades are becoming divisions, and divisions are becoming corps, when you understand their mobilization system and you look at the maps with the names, you go, oh no, this isn't a mobilization of 250,000 men. It's 500,000 to a million men, and it's not over. And the mobilization's been going on now for 10 weeks and 2 more. So and there's no reaction, no mobilization in the West. What is this? What comes? And then China's mobilized. People are speculating that China is going to strike at Taiwan, or maybe a wider strike. And here, I think you heard the news that they've been loading tanks on the West Coast to be going somewhere across the Pacific.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you what do you see playing out next? And I've got some more questions of how this relates to COVID and some of the plans that relate to that, because that's, well, I guess as I understand, what China's original intentions was to release a biological weapon that would weaken America and enable an easy kinetic war on our soil to claim, because we know that China is, struggling to feed its own people on top of a million other
Mhm.
problems that have it, really on the brink of collapse. So how does this all play out, and what do you see unfolding?
Well, I'm not as optimistic as I was some months ago because more news has come about. It turns out that China does not have a deficit in food, as many people speculated. They think the Chinese liked that speculation. The stories that their warehouses were empty and their food was rotted away, that was disinformation. Um, Now you see recent stories that China has most of the food on the planet that's in storage is in China.
Yeah, I saw that come out the
Yeah.
past 3 or 4
And
weeks.
this
Yeah.
is very alarming because why would they stockpile that tremendous amount of food? They are doing that because the only reason to do that is in anticipation of a war, because their supplies of food in the US, Canada, Australia, Argentina, etc., would be cut off in the first months of a war. And that a biological war, which could involve the use of anti crop biological weapons that we could use on them, might make growing problematic. And they have to make sure with 1.4 billion people that they're going to have enough food. So that's alarming. That's very alarming. Now, the collapse of their economy. I Maybe I mentioned this on your show earlier. I talked to a Wall Street banker because I'm in the committee on the present danger China, and I attend their meetings. Um, and this banker is very well informed on the economic moves back and forth, and he was quite pleased because he said China's making all these terrible mistakes. They are collapsing their own economy. How are they collapsing it? By getting ready for war.
Yeah, moving it into a war economy, which will
Moving into
collapse
war
a
economy is
peacetime
collapsing their
economy.
peacetime economy. Yes, and this is rather obvious to him. And this, of course, going into a war solves a lot of their economic problems because they tell their people, we're rationing everything and everything's going to become harder because the Americans have been aggressive and they've pushed us to the wall and we have to fight back. That's the propaganda in China. That's what every totalitarian country blames the countries they're about to invade and attack and bomb. They blame their victim. That's Stalin outlined that years ago. That's what you do. Um, and that's what they're doing. But the thing is that yeah, they're civilian. They're not going to be producing consumer goods for us because they won't be able to ship them here because they're planning something larger. Now, you asked about the pandemic.
Yeah, and I'll frame a little more of that question because, like, you have it seemed like there was a perfect scenario, and again, if you look back and look at Event 201, look at, Lockstep that came out in 2010, that there was a scenario of using the pandemic to introduce this, global technocracy and using it to, what we're seeing, what we're seeing the truckers fight back against in Canada is that a lot of people have seen their rights completely stripped away and that they're doing that. Now, we also talked about how the first round of the biological, attack of COVID was supposed to wipe out more people. So do you think that the globalist plan that you think of, they think globalist, the UN, the World Economic Forum, et cetera, to use the pandemic to bring in these totalitarian measures, do you think that that perhaps had failed and now they're having to go to maybe the backup plan, which is pushing for a war, which we love, the globalists love wars because it fuels their fuels their economy, fuels their fills their coffers. Um, or do you think that, and I guess in addition to that, why is it that we now have George Soros, who's typically you look at as being one of the more kind of globalist, person tied over to Europe, why is he now coming out attacking Xi, saying that the Olympics are a Nazi Germany era Olympic facade of propaganda, and that Xi's inability to contain the virus in China is going to lead to his collapse. I guess, like, how do you make sense of that stage?
Well, what do you mean by the word globalist?
When I think of globalists, I think of the people like the UN, the people that are pushing more towards that the vision of the Build Back Better, the one world government that they've been pushing.
Well, the UN is the one world government. Already has been since 1945. It's not much of a government. They haven't broken down national sovereignty. Um, when you mention George Soros came out of communist Hungary. He was an immigrant, I think, to the UK initially. How does a person as a poor immigrant end up going to a Western country and becoming a billionaire? You suppose he did it without help? He was coming from the communist bloc. And if you follow his career, he's been financing the communist left. And of course, he makes a big show out of being the enemy of Putin and Russia, right? Of supporting um, Ukrainian independence and fighting China. He's not to be believed. I think he's a laundromat for communist overseas money. That's what I think he is. I mean, it's very hard to prove anything like that. But if you look at him closely, there's no way he can be honest. And the show he puts on to be an enemy of Putin, he did nothing of the kind. He hasn't hurt Putin at all. He's hurt the United States by supporting the left here. And
Yeah.
what is the policy of the left? Not to rebuild America's nuclear arsenal, which is rotting away. Minuteman threes, they were deployed when I was a little boy in the 60s. These are old missiles. We got rid of our newer missiles, the MX. We got rid of them under George W. Bush. Our nuclear warheads are actually, they're really past their life. They've had to tone them down to keep them. And the head of the Strategic Command said in 2020 in February in testimony before Congress 2 years ago, he said in 3 years the arsenal will be basically past its shelf life, unreliable. We're going to have and we won't have a new nuclear warhead. We're trying to build the infrastructure to rebuild them until 2029. Russians have new nuclear warheads. The Chinese have new nuclear warheads, new missiles, hypersonic missiles, all kinds of new weapons. Welfare for the Pentagon is not mostly for weapons. And as far as the globalists loving war, no, money, you lose money in war. War is destruction. It destroys things. They are soft bourgeois people. And what is a globalist? A banker. People have this misunderstanding. The banks put this person in power. You know what? The banks gave to both sides in the election. Either one that gets into power, you say, no, people who are wealthy have to buy insurance, political insurance, because they can be prosecuted, they can be investigated, they can be harassed by the government. They need the government to be at least listening to them, not to go after them. You look again all over we've put businessmen in jail all the time. And we're a capitalist country. right? And of course, businessmen aren't perfect, and the governments in the Western countries aren't the puppets of businessmen. Some senators and politicians are bought by them, but that's the insurance the businessmen are paying. So look at how everybody was pushed into China. President Trump made this point again and again. My friends wish they could invest in America, but they invest in China because that's the only investment that pays, right? Because everything was structured that way. Now, I ask you, how great or wise or strategically informed are the capitalists? All they do is they calculate profit and loss. And the communists knew that. And they look at the cheap labor in China and they just said, China is good. Come on in, do business with us. And it was irresistible. The West could not resist it because capitalism is not like the system in Russia or China, which is oriented toward military and political power and dominance. The West is oriented toward making money and making things that make life better for people. The standard of living is high in the West. If this was all a conspiracy to pauperize us and make us poor, it's a darn poor conspiracy because we've lived very well for many decades. But you look in Russia and China, the people don't live so well because they're building weapons, because it's all about global dominance. Uh, Mao Zedong said political power flows out of the barrel of a gun. All right.
Yeah.
Well, people, the globalists, it's all about money. All right. You have all the money. We'll have all the guns. Stick them up. Now we have all the money and all the guns. That's what's going on. It's actually playing out right in front of us. But I didn't answer your question about COVID. Isn't it interesting that COVID breaks out of China? That's their alibi, right? They got it first. COVID breaks out in China. And then the mobilizations start in China and Russia. And we're closer to world war than ever. And look at what the pandemic has done. The lockdowns have damaged our economies, have ruined the dollar. On the eve of a war, what do you need? You need money for tanks and weapons. We have no money. Our budgets are all busted. We can't even afford to mobilize because it would break the bank. And there's the Russians and Chinese getting ready. And we just have to live in this denial and say, nothing here, move along.
Yeah.
It's just,
And the
and so,
mandates are weakening our military.
and the mandates, I mean, you've vaccinated a lot of military people. And I think, as you know, it's coming out that the vaccines don't work. It's coming out that there are vaccine injuries. And this is going to add to the discredit of the Western governments because at a war, what do you need? You need people to believe in the government at the beginning of a war because the government's going to tell them how to be safe and how to fight. And yet these governments in Western Europe and the United States and Canada have bungled so badly in this pandemic that the most patriotic citizens don't trust their own government.
Yeah, I think that the American trust in our government is probably the lowest it's ever been right now.
Oh yeah, and when the government the longer they delay in admitting they made a mistake in their policies regarding the pandemic, and also to cover up the fact that China released it and that it was a bioweapon, and that the Chinese so brilliantly look, the Chinese infiltrated you look at our drug companies, they're all in bed with China. You look at Fauci, he's in bed with China. They say, oh, the global elite and Fauci made the weapon. No, they couldn't make it here because it was illegal, because they had some crazy scheme. They made it in China and the Chinese released it. Isn't that perfect? The Chinese have an alibi. Fauci did it. Blame Fauci. But look, it's part of a coordinated, strategic, carefully thought out set of moves. They have hurt us badly in a giant sabotage. It's a toxic weapon. The spike protein is toxic. This bioweapon was a toxic weapon. They sabotaged our health system. Look at nurses, doctors quitting all over the place. Our health system is ready to collapse. So when the next weapon, maybe hemorrhagic fever, is released, there'll just be panic. Nobody will trust the government. They won't know what to do. If it hasn't been for these doctors, these courageous doctors who've risked their licenses and have stood up, we wouldn't have a basis for defense. Our basis for defense is those doctors. So, and I think we've gotten off light because I think the weapon that the Chinese developed didn't work, wasn't as effective as they hoped because it had a high rate of mutation. Um, but the government's got to admit, they've got to admit they failed. They've got to say we were wrong, and they've got to recoup their credibility. If they don't do it, it's look at what's happening. And now, if all the governments have reacted badly in Ukraine and improperly in the Far East, Russia and China have shown themselves to be in control internationally. And look, Putin is going to be meeting with Xi on the 4th. What is that, Friday? And not only that, the he's going to be meeting with the leaders of France and Germany. So he's already got the beginning of splitting NATO. If NATO splits and Europe is so frightened it makes a separate deal with Russia, we're all alone. And it's all then set, the stage is set for Russia and China to come after us.
Is that what you see playing out?
I think that's what they've been planning for a long time. And I've talked to defectors. Colonel Stanislav Lunev was a military defector. He outlined a lot of this to me years ago. They have divided up North America. I think I've mentioned this on the program. Lunev said that the last time he was at a meeting of the Russian generals, this was under the Russian Federation, not under the Soviet Union. They said the nuclear war plan against America is still on. We are going to divide North America as follows. Russia gets Alaska and parts of Canada. China gets the lower 48. And we know from the secret speech of Chi Hao-chun, they want the lower 48 because they want to exterminate most of the population here. They want to colonize it, make a second China here because China's overpopulated. They need to move about 700 million people somewhere else.
Their land no longer supports them.
Right. And to do that, it's to avoid getting nuclear retaliation themselves. To do it, they need to do it in special stages. And, about invading Ukraine, it's a complicated thing because Ukraine is basically already a Soviet country. It could be rolled back into the Soviet Union in a fortnight. That's what Boris Chikolay, who wrote a paper on this years ago, said, that Ukraine was set up after the fall of the Soviet Union in such a way, these are his exact words, as to be rolled back into the Union in a fortnight. Okay. So will they actually invade it? If they do it, I predict it will be an Anschluss. So you got all these people, Andrei Illarionov, saying they don't have enough troops. Andrei is not a military expert, and he says the Ukrainian soldiers will fight. I heard from a Ukrainian in eastern Ukraine. He says the army's demoralized. The generals aren't getting ready. They're not doing what they need to defend against Russia. They know if the Russians attack, it will be all over in a matter of days. So it's already set to be a surrender, an Anschluss. Basically what happened to Austria in 1938. The German troops moved in. There was no defense. There was no fighting. They just went over. And if you look at Ukrainian opinion polls, yes, in Western Ukraine, you have a very virulent anti-Moscow pocket of opinion. Maybe 20 to 25% of Ukrainian opinion is virulently hostile to Russia. And but most of them don't understand it's still the Soviet Union, although you will hear Ukrainians who do understand that. But the bulk of Ukrainians say the Russians are our Slavic brothers. Okay, if we have to be in union with, we'd like to be part of the EU, but if America's being bad and Russia's being threatened, maybe we have to be part of Russia again. I don't think we've understood the Ukrainian system or the Ukrainian people, and that this switch of Ukraine, and especially if NATO breaks, there could be a negotiation like what happened in Czechoslovakia in 1938. The West just sort of caved and said, all right. And they handed the Sudetenland over, and the Czech state broke apart. Slovakia left Czechoslovakia, it's separated, and the Germans just occupied the remainder, the Moravia, Bohemia, the Czech parts of Czechoslovakia. And there was no battle. And the Czech fortifications and the Czech military was considered quite good. And it was quite inconceivable that the Germans would have an easy time of it, but they did. And that could be, in a very studied way, with cooperation from Russia's agents and friends in Ukraine, could be accomplished without people say they never do this with this violence. Well, yeah, they're willing to take the chance, I think. And this buildup is very serious, very big.
Mm. So, of the three world powers, United States, Russia, China, we're in a situation where the United States is on its knees. It's crippled by COVID. It's crippled by Biden, in the White House. We didn't see these things happening under Trump, under the military buildup of him. We saw that. I think that you saw a lot more respect for America under Trump, whereas now it's just, we see what's happening, and so while we see America crippled, we see the two big bullies now strengthening and teaming up together on the. So where's the hope for America? Where's the how can we get through this? Where do you see this going?
Well, the United States, I mean, first of all, no, United States shouldn't have engaged in the military adventures in Afghanistan and Iraq. That was
Yeah,
a waste of resources. It was uh, it was ridiculous. Nothing was achieved strategically. We were lured into there by the 9/11 attack. Um, and of course, Al Qaeda, if you look at the testimony of Alexander Litvinenko, Al Qaeda was completely infiltrated by Russian intelligence, and the
yeah.
Russians used Al Qaeda.
Trained, funded, everything.
Well, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of al-Qaeda, was trained in, after bin Laden's death, was trained in Russia. And many other leaders were, according to Litvinenko. And Litvinenko paid the ultimate price for going public as a former FSB officer. He was poisoned by Putin's agent, Lugovoy, I think was his name. They found the traces of the radioactive polonium on the Lufthansa airplanes that he flew from Moscow into London. And he poisoned the guy, and he died a horrible death of radiation poisoning. And he said Putin did it. And why did Putin do it? Because he was telling the truth. He said Putin is the terrorist. Putin is behind 9/11. He's behind the whole terror thing. And what did it do? It lured us into these mistaken adventures in Afghanistan and Iraq. So how do we the one advantage we have is we're far away from Russia and China. We have oceans between us. Although the Russians and Chinese are moving in to support Cuba and Venezuela. Chile has gone over with a pro-communist politician being elected. Peru's new president is a communist. I was told by the former vice president of Peru. I had a conversation with him a couple months back. Um, you've got Honduras's Castro is her name. The new president's gonna. I don't know if the inauguration's happened yet, but I guess Vice President Harris is going to be present, right? So these Latin American countries are going over to communism, and they're talking about like forming a kind of block of countries. Hugo Chavez's chief of air staff, I interviewed him 20 years ago, and says the whole goal is to create a communist bloc in South America, Latin America. That was Chavez's dream. Chavez was a communist, um, a friend of Fidel, right? So people say, NATO surrounded Russia. No, we're being surrounded. We're being isolated. It's the other way around. And we're not arming, and we're not defending, and we're not, and this thing is, we're a big threat. We're a horrible. Yeah. Where's your bomb shelter? The Russians and Chinese have bomb shelters. They have prepared civil defenses. Russia's deployed multiple regiments of their new S-500 ABM system. We don't have any real ABMs. Our ABMs are experimental. Hit a rocket with a rocket. There's 50 launchers in Alaska and like 14 in California. They can't stop a Russian missile. They probably can't stop a Chinese missile. Maybe a North Korean missile they can stop. This is not real defense. We don't have real defenses. We haven't been defending. We don't have defenses against biological war, as the pandemic shows. We have traitors and corrupt officials who can easily be manipulated into the wrong policies that will make the biological attack stronger than it otherwise would have been. So that even a miscarried biological attack would have more effect. So this is what we're mulled out. We're full of traitors. We're ideologically divided. How are we a threat to them? They've prepared this for decades. This is the analysis here is very clear. Even though we're all distracted by it's the Jews and the banksters and all this, the anti-Semitism and the conspiracy theories and you haven't understood. How many divisions does the Pope have? Was Stalin's cynical Like we're gonna take over Poland, the Pope will object, No. How many divisions does the Bank of America have? How many divisions does, any of the globalists have? Or how many missiles or how many nuclear what? No. It's like Mao said, political power flows out of the barrel of a gun, and the ultimate gun is a missile with a nuclear warhead or an Ixander missile with a thermobaric bomb warhead. We don't understand. We have not kept up with this. And I hear the analysts and I just grieve. I just grieve at the lack of clarity and how easily they have been misdirected to looking at the wrong things. You got to look at baseball. Keep your eye on the ball. Remember, your kid, you're playing baseball, your dad's shouting, keep your eye on the ball. We have not kept our eye on the ball. It's that simple.
Now the ball's coming pretty strongly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what do you see playing out over the course of the next couple of years?
It's very difficult to predict because the Russians and Chinese strategists are so good, and they're so good at misdirection. They're so good at making you think they're going here and then they go there. They always have surprises. You see, surprise is a basic strategic element. You can only flank or leverage successfully if you surprise. If you prepare a flanking action and the enemy sees it in advance, they're there on the flank ready to protect. So you have to every move. And of course, what I see is we're open and we're still not getting it. We're still not understanding their strategy. You have to know the mind of the enemy. And so I think what they want to do is they want to break down NATO. That's the number one objective of Russia. So watch these negotiations between Putin and the new German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and of course French President Macron. Watch the meeting between Putin and Xi at the beginning of the Olympics, the Genocide Olympics, right? Watch that. Watch for further trouble in the Far East and then watch for, look, it was just reported the Russians jammed the GPS over Israel the other day. I don't know if did you see that news item?
No, I didn't.
That even endangered flights going into Ben Gurion Airport in Israel. And the Israelis complained and the Russians said, we're defending ourselves. We're having exercises with the Syrian Air Force and we're making sure you're not going to cause us any trouble. And of course, Israel is very concerned that Iran is getting close, that they have to, there's indications there could be a war between Iran and Israel in the Middle East. Why wouldn't that be a thing? War between Iran and Israel in the Middle East. The Russian army fully mobilized and absorbing Ukraine by whatever means, forcing NATO to come to terms. China, ready to go against Taiwan, ready to put Japan under the most horrific pressure you can imagine, in Australia, and maybe North Korea, forcing the issue between North and South Korea. And look at who the South Korean president is. I mean, the guy is basically just ready to give in to the communists because of his own left-wing views. So what do we got? We have a formula for them suddenly advancing to a position of global dominance very quickly in a way that we can't counter. And I don't know why they wouldn't do it. Why wouldn't they? We have believed falsely in our own strength, which has been partly a myth, all these decades, and you can't hardly convince an American that Russia and China aren't enemies. You can't hardly convince an American that we aren't the lone superpower, that Russia's just a regional power, like Obama used to say. No. Russia has a bigger nuclear arsenal than us, more modernized. How can Russia then just be a regional power? Russian and Chinese navies are bigger than us. Their ability to transport troops over bodies of water is greater than us combined, because now the Hong Kong merchant marine is under China, and the Chinese and the Hong Kong merchant marine are bigger than ours. So whatever sea lift capacity we have, they have more. And you add Russia's, I'm sorry, but Alaska will be under threat. The homeland is under threat. You watch Mexico. You watch Cuba. Are there troops or missiles being moved into the Western Hemisphere? I think that may come next. I think that the United States, and with this administration, you can guarantee they will do the exact wrong thing in response. They will talk a good line, and people will go, oh, there's nothing to worry about. That's the
until
way it's
there
been
is.
with us, always.
So do you think that, and we're nearing our hour before we jump over for, Q&A, but do you think that China with the economic problems, I know they have the food stores, but they're also, as you've talked about, with the grand solar minimum and just Mother Nature wreaking havoc on them, not to mention the pollution and everything. Are they in a position where they have to take action or else they are crippled, like, as we talked about previously, that they're in this tight spot? It's either, risk moving forward with the war and or just stay stagnant and collapse.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned before. I spoke to a Hong Kong businessman a few months ago who had been involved in China. He got kicked out of China, and he had contacts in Beijing. And they said something along these lines that uh, China had no choice. That the timing is now. That their plan was to come after us in 2035. That was the original plan. I think that Russia and China had agreed on. That's my guess because they always like to take it slow because slow is sure. Our guard is down. We're stupid. They can get their friends elected here in the West. They can guide our flight, so to speak, towards the crash landing that they need us to crash. But they have rushed things now. They're rushing it, and it may indeed be because of the grand solar minimum and the food shortages that are coming. We already saw the volcanic eruption in the South Pacific. And this is something that happens during grand solar minimums. The reduced electromagnetic activity of the sun correlates with increased volcanic activity. There's some kind of relationship. The kind of electromagnetic phenomenon that occurs in the Earth is somehow related to volcanic eruptions. And so this giant eruption, which put uh, volcanic dust and ash up 150,000 feet, they've already announced there's going to be massive crop losses in the southern hemisphere because of lowered global temperatures. And already, grand solar minimum is causing havoc with food production. And we're really in a merciful position because the Earth is closer to the sun than it usually is in this period, so that the effects are mitigated. But in the next couple of years, starting in 2025, that's going to start to alleviate. And the effects of the grand solar minimum um, uh, are going to be felt in terms of the loss of grain production. It's definitely going to happen. So this could be driving their timing. It could be.
Mm. And I guess one last question for you is what do you make of the buses, the flights, the shipments of fighting age men being brought in the United States, in Florida and Westchester, New York? Like, we're seeing increasingly, videos coming out of these people, and they're not women and children. These are people that are 30s, 20s, 30s, 40s. Do you think that that's part of this plan?
If you go back to your interview you did with me last summer, I had gotten information then through some people related to defense work who had contacts um, in in the East, in Eastern Europe, and they were told that the Russian special services, the Russian general staff, had made agreements with the Mexican cartels to move weapons and Spetsnaz troops across the Mexican border. You may remember I had mentioned this. And I didn't know of any specific movement of people yet. They'd made the agreement, and there were Russian officials pretending to be Ukrainians, by the way, on the border being driven around by cartel people, looking at different border crossings. I even was given photographs of some of these folks by some of my sources down on the border. So uh, now what's happened? I've got multiple sources telling me that Russian nationals of military age, single men, are crossing the border in large numbers. And this has been reported up the chain of command. And I'm told that so far there's been no reaction. It's sort of a panicked silence. It's like, what do we do? How do we react to that? And the reason this is scary is because in advance of a world war, not only would you expect a biological attack on the West before the war begins as a softening up thing, which is described in other defector literature like Viktor Suvorov's Spetsnaz, but there was a 6 to 8,000 man Spetsnaz deployment to the United States of sabotage Spetsnaz troops to deploy to infiltrate the United States in advance of a war, and on a signal to go to their caches, get their uniforms, get their weapons. These weapons would include chemical, toxic, biological weapons, even nuclear weapons. Colonel Stanislav Lunev testified before Congress on this because he was tasked as the deputy head of the GRU in the US, which fought with finding hiding places for Russian nuclear weapons in the US. So they would smuggle them in, hide them for a few weeks or months, and then the attack, when the assault would begin, we would be attacked from within first. That would be the first indications. And they are taking these steps now. So this is serious. This is very serious.
It is. Um, yeah, it is. But I think that it's an important conversation to have, and I appreciate all of your research and all your thoughts on this, because I think that, um, while for me, when I take a step back, I do believe that God is in control, and that's where I have to, because I think sometimes when it looks like we're up against the edge of a cliff, that's where I find the strength to kind of keep going, right? And so, but I also think that with that, keep that in mind, is that it's important to have these discussions and to look at these things and to look at, actually, it's interesting because my Thursday show is all about prepping. So I think it's a very appropriate show to have with this, because, we have to, again, hope for hope for the best, but prepare for the worst.
Well, faith means that if you can't run, you walk. If you can't walk, you crawl. And if you can't crawl, you wriggle, right? You just keep going. Um, because I mean, nobody gets out of this life alive, and it's doing what's right that matters, sticking by the truth. And if we do that, eventually things will turn out right. But we haven't been very truthful in this country. We've lied to ourselves, and that is perhaps the worst kind of lying.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. So we're going to transfer over to Q&A. I'm sure we've got a lot of good questions brewing. Up until 3:30, we'll do question and answers. So the Q&A is over on Rise TV, which you've all heard me talk about by now. If you want to check it out,